It's a pleasure to welcome you all to a reprise of the 2007 MLA NLM Joseph Leiter Lecture. Joseph Leiter was the first Associate Director for Library Operations excuse me, here at the National Library of Medicine. I think he became that in like 1965. And when he retired, there was a lecture endowed. He also contributed to the endowment in his name. It's a sort of a joint activity between the Medical Library Association and the National Library of Medicine, and is given alternately in either here at NLM or at the MLA annual meeting. And in this case, Kent Smith recently gave the lecture at MLA, but it is about NLM's history, and we thought it would be great if he could do it again here, so more of us here, including myself, who had to miss it, could hear it. I think most people here know that Kent Smith was NLM's deputy director for, I don't know, a quarter century or whatever, and during that time, he was responsible for making sure that, the National Library of Medicine ran on time and did what it was supposed to do, and he did an outstanding job of keeping us all moving forward. But in addition to that, we might have viewed that as his most important contribution, but he actually was a major figure in national and even international science and technology information policy, and behind the scenes had quite a lot to do with a variety of federal information policies that could have been could have caused NLM a great deal of trouble and other agencies too, but don't because of his vigilance and work. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Kent back to the podium, which he seems to come to at recurring intervals, to give what I know will be a very interesting lecture.
Well, we can lower the lights if you'd like, I don't know. Okay, well, it's thank you, Betsy, for a kind introduction, and to all of you that have come here today. Good morning, and really welcome to a rerun of the Leiter Lecture I presented a month ago in Philadelphia. And at that time, I explained to the convention participants that day that I'm often conflicted by retirement, and I told them I was nevertheless very surprised to receive their kind invitation to speak, but reminded them that in fact I was retired. I told them once that I recovered from the shock of the invitation. I quickly realized the lecture involves some serious work ahead, and I knew I'd better get to it. My first step was to enlist the help of my dog, Socks. I learned early in my career the wisdom of Harry Truman when he said, "You want a friend in Washington? Get a dog." So Socks listened to my remarks. The good news is that I stayed within the time limit. The bad news is that unfortunately he fell asleep. But seriously, I must tell you all, it is for me a distinct honor to be associated with this lecture named for Dr. Joseph Leiter. Joe was for many years, as Betsy mentioned, NLM's Associate Director for Library Operations, and he was one of the most important figures in the history over the 171 years at the National Library of Medicine. Although Joe was a tough manager, he had strong humanistic qualities. He did much for advancing librarianship and recruiting women and minorities into the profession. Joe stamped quality on everything he pursued, and to lecture in his name is to have the bar set high. This lecture in his name will be a bit of a trip down memory lane, for Joe and I traveled much of the road together. It will be like a play with 4 acts that feature 3 leading actors and a distinguished cast of supporting actors. Our play deals with the modern NLM, so we'll dispose with the 1836 and all that, and begin our examination in 1956. That year was marked by interesting people and events. The ticket of Eisenhower and Nixon was elected. Martin Luther King emerged as a leader of desegregation. Fidel Castro began his invasion of Cuba, and Elvis Presley burst onto the scene with blue suede shoes. In 1956, science was advancing, with Bell Labs beginning the development of the visual telephone, and Albert Sabin creating the oral polio vaccine. Oh, and by the way, yours truly entered college with his first exposure to politics. But of greatest importance to the future of the library was the passage of the 1956 NLM Act, which this past year celebrated its 50th anniversary. So we will start with how NLM was established. Dr. Michael DeBakey must be considered one of the prime movers of the 1956 National Library of Medicine Act. He is a legend who played a key role in what was a protracted and arduous struggle to make the National Library of Medicine a reality. Let me highlight some of the major stops along the road, each action to study or report, of which there were really many, leading up to the eventual signing of the Act by President Eisenhower on August 3, 1956. It dealt with one or more of the following issues: the need to establish a clear legal authority for the library, the need to ascertain the organization and physical location of it, to carry out that mission, and the very pressing need to replace a dilapidated facility. Actually, talk of a new building to replace the Army Medical Museum and Library that was on the Washington Mall began around World War I, when librarian William Owen in 1916 began plans for a new structure. Some wanted it on the Mall, while others favored it further out in D.C. near Walter Reed Army Hospital. In the early 1930s, activist Dr. Harvey Cushing, whose daughter was married, incidentally, to President Roosevelt's son, made numerous appeals to FDR to advance the cause. The Librarian of Congress concurred in the need and offered, no doubt with pure motives, that it could nicely be located on Capitol Hill adjacent to the Library of Congress. The presidents wanted to help, but unfortunately the country's Great Depression and the advent of World War II interfered. A turning point in the future of the Army Medical Library took place in 1942 with the assignment of a young Army medical officer by the name of Michael DeBakey to the Surgical Consultants Division of the Office of the Surgeon General. There he was given the responsibility for preparing, as he put it, military orders without any background in military medicine. Dr. DeBakey made frequent use of the library, and he saw firsthand the deplorable physical and crowded conditions of the library. I was impressed with the library's extensive scope, he said, but the building that housed the collection was very old. The roof leaked, they had to put tarpaulins over the books when it rained, and they even had to use an outhouse for toilet facilities. He soon learned of the futile efforts that had been made to secure a new facility and concluded that in a military environment, a library did not stack up very well next to tanks and artillery. Michael DeBakey became an effective activist on behalf of what he called a national treasure. Serving as an influential member of the Association of Honorary Consultants to the Army Medical Library, his stirring speech before the consultants in 1950 struck to the heart of the matter and did much to galvanize the medical community. As he put it, in considering the place of the library in government, I believe that emphasis should be put first upon the purpose of the function of a national library, and then a more intelligent consideration can be given as to who should operate it. Director Frank B. Rogers, who had fought long and hard for a new library, was despondent when told, "Rogers, you're never going to get that building, you're never going to get it." DeBakey, determined not to give up, requested that Rogers provide him with a comprehensive chronology of past efforts to help prepare him for the various battles ahead. The opportunity for real breakthrough came in 1955 with the second Hoover Commission's release of its report on federal medical services, an influential report that DeBakey played a major role in creating. Although a proposal for increased spending hardly was consistent with the Commission's mandate, which was to reduce costs, DeBakey reports that at a luncheon meeting he told Mr. Hoover that the library was the most important recommendation. That carried the day, and soon thereafter Senator Hill and Kennedy co-sponsored S. 3430, and Representative Percy Priest entered the companion House bill. Senator Hill was a clear driver of the bill in both houses, as he was regarded by the colleagues as a statesman of health. This was to be just the beginning of the championing support for NLM. On April 10th and 11, 1956, Senator Hill opened hearings on S-3430 in the old Supreme Court chamber of the Capitol. Senator Kennedy, who testified first, was a fellow member of Hill's Senate Committee on Labor and Public Welfare, as well as the chairman of the Reorganization Subcommittee of Government Operations, the very committee that was charged with considering the recommendation of the Hoover Report. Kennedy entered the report into the record, and in so doing provided sort of a template for the bill being considered. When it had been introduced a month earlier, press reports across the country cited the need for legislation to rescue the library from its status of a stepchild in the Defense Department. The Commission report lauded the services the library performed for researchers, and as the Boston Herald so succinctly put it, one 3x5 card mailed for 10 cents can keep a team of medical researchers from needlessly duplicating a previous experiment. The testimony before the committee was riveting, pointing out that the activities of the library had grown beyond that of the military departmental library to the level of a national library. Yet, as DeBakey, Hill, Kennedy, and Rogers pointed out in the hearings, the authorization for the expanded activities was tenuous at best. DeBakey testified that the weak legislative authorization for the library was contained in an 1892 joint congressional resolution and a 1901 act which, quote, placed the resources of the Army Medical Library at the disposal of the duly qualified individuals in the states and territories in the District of Columbia. Now, Janet Doe testified on behalf of the Medical Library Association as a librarian of the New York Academy of Medicine and as one who had participated in a 1944 survey of the Army Medical Library. As she put it, the library's growth and efficiency while in the Army's hands vacillated distressingly between feast and famine. Saying that the problems in the medical literature are quite different from those of the general literature, she made the point that medical libraries thrive best under medical authorities. She also strongly objected to a provision calling for the library to impose charges for special services that were of benefit to particular patrons. Janet Doe was not shy about commenting on this, stating, "You can't make distinction between users. Services should be provided alike to all. The whole provision in this bill's impossible." I didn't know Janet Doe, but that gave me a better understanding of why she is held in such high esteem by the Medical Library Association. On June 11, 1956, the Senate bill passed quickly, along with a provision calling for the construction of the library in or near the District of Columbia. Given that Senator Hill was actively lobbying for the bill among his House colleagues, the realization of a new library seemed absolutely inevitable. Earlier, however, actually on April Fool's Day, the Chicago Sunday Tribune ran an editorial, and in it proposed that the library be located in Chicago, the communications center of the nation. In the House, some 11 bills calling for a location library in Chicago were offered. Mayor Richard Daley, with a strong urging of the noted JAMA editor Dr. Morris Fishbein, formed a pressure group of some 19 prominent medical deans, health officials, and corporate leaders to lobby Congress. 9 acres of land was offered free by the Chicago Medical Center Commission. So the Chicago dream would have looked something like this today. Speaker Sam Rayburn held up the quick passage of the Priest bill and provided tacit approval of the Chicago's group effort by directing that hearings be held on their numerous bills in the House Administration Committee and chaired by Congressman O'Brien of Illinois. On June 19, 1956, that committee was called to order to begin testimony from a spirited set of witnesses highlighted by Mayor Daley and his colleagues. They advanced a series of arguments about how Chicago was centrally located and had many medical-related institutions and associations. A week later, the Washington advocates had their chance for rebuttal, and some of the most powerful testimony was given by 3 librarians. Brad Rogers made the case that the Armed Forces Medical Library served both as a national library and as a regional medical library for the Washington area. He said that moving the library outside the region would require rebuilding a collection in Washington at considerable expense. Now, Mary Louise Marshall followed that up, stating moving the library to Chicago would create almost insurmountable problems in administration resulting from loss in staff, and to recreate that expertise would take years. Fred Kilgore, librarian of the Yale Medical Library, delivered a resolution on behalf of the MLA and testified to the naivete of the Chicago's groups, concept of a library being only an organization for servicing readers and mailing out books and photocopies. He emphasized that the bill envisioned the library concerned with an overall program for maintaining and increasing the availability of medical information throughout the government and the nation. Unfortunately, about this time, House leadership sent out word to all the committees chairs that since the congressional session was coming to a close, only non-controversial bills would be considered for passage. The library bill was considered controversial. The Post reported on July 14, 1956, the Chicago boys are said to have gone to the Speaker Rayburn with demands that the bill for location of the library in Washington be killed. Speaker Rayburn held the keys to passage or defeat, and DeBakey, being also from Texas, was called on to intervene. DeBakey felt he couldn't personally ask Rayburn to release the bill, but he said he had a plan. He said he would contact Mrs. Dorothy Vandenberg, Secretary of the Democratic National Committee, and a wife of a gentleman he had performed a heart operation on. As DeBakey put it, she had been most grateful at the time and told me that I should not hesitate to call her if there was anything she could ever do to help me. DeBakey called her, she got in touch with the Speaker, and soon the bill was released. The last major hurdle had been cleared. The bill was promptly passed by voice vote with the caveat that the library's actual location would be left up to the future Board of Regents. They chose the site of the old Glenbrook Golf Course in Bethesda, Maryland. Ground was broken on June 12, 1959. Construction encountered a solid layer of problems, and rocks and blasting became a way of life. But by December of 1961, the building was virtually complete, and on the 14th of that month, dedication ceremonies were held, with Senator Hill and Secretary Ribicoff speaking to the assembled group. In Strickland's book, Politics, Science, and Dreaded Disease, the author describes the period from 1955 to 1968 as the lush times for medical research. From the time Lister Hill in the Senate, John Fogerty in the House, and James Shannon at NIH assumed their respective posts, neither presidents, cabinet secretaries, nor other high-level government officials could control the direction or pace of biomedical research in the country. From the early 1940s, when philanthropists Mary Lasker and Florence Mahoney entered the scene and first visited Senator Claude Pepper, the case for building biomedical research as a national priority had been building. Teamed with medical giants Dr. Sidney Farber and Dr. DeBakey, as well as others like Mike Gorman, who was the noted journalist and lobbyist who worked with Lasker, the alarms were sounded and the Congress took up the gauntlet and did the job. Now, while creating the 1956 Act was long and laborious struggle, the next two major NLM pieces of legislation came somewhat easier. Hardly a slam dunk, however, but for they arose as the lush times for medical research were reaching their peak. On New Year's Day of 1964, Dr. Martin Cummings was officially appointed the director of the NLM. Having previously headed up both NIH's International Research and Research Grants programs under Shannon, Dr. Cummings brought to the institution a new perspective on its mission. Speaking to the Board of Regents 2 weeks before assuming his duties, he said the library has a need to broaden its interest to provide a creative, imaginative contribution to increasing complexity of communications. He moved quickly to more fully develop the MedLive system, but his eyes are also on expanding the NLM mission to include legislation for a vigorous grants program and for creation of a research and development program. This vision will lead to a major expansion of the library and ultimately to the need for a new building. Dr. Cummings' arrival at NLM coincided with a number of propitious circumstances. The federal government was entering into an unprecedented development of scientific and technical information initiatives, in part in response to the launching of Sputnik and fear of Soviet dominance in STI. The NIH research program, as I just mentioned, was expanding. The President's Commission on Heart Disease, Cancer, and Stroke, chaired by DeBakey, was gearing up to release its landmark report. And within the NLM and the medical library community, much preparatory work was being advanced in support of the need for increased resources for medical libraries. As Dickens would say, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. While the medical research enterprise was booming, medical libraries were neglected. The 1953 survey by Dietrich and Benson found that medical libraries were dangerously inadequate in meeting the needs of medical research and education, and 10 years later, things had only deteriorated. Harold Bloomquist, in his excellent 1963 report on the status of medical school libraries, confirmed the weakened condition of medical libraries. The services shown here, most of which today are considered basic library services, could not be provided because of the lack of resources. Despite the ever-growing demands for information services from 1953 to 1963, support for medical libraries actually decreased, while biomedical research was increasing fourfold. There were other notable efforts made that pointed out this serious deficiency in the research process. DeBakey wrote a powerful article that scolded the medical community for allowing their libraries to deteriorate into inefficient, poorly staffed, badly housed, and decaying repositories. Meanwhile, NLM's Deputy Director, Scott Adams, ably assisted by Estelle Brodman, was quietly but busily formulating a plan to help medical libraries should the opportunity present itself. Marty Cummings decided that the imbalance between library resources and demand for services had to be rectified, and as a politically astute administrator, he set out to do just that. In defending the legislation he had in mind for providing library assistance locally and regionally, he eloquently spoke these words at Conway Library. It is my view that the time has come for rapid expansion of library resources locally. Continued dependence of the more than 6,000 medical libraries upon the services of the NLM would lead ultimately to the evolution of a monolithic medical library resource in this nation. For the convenience of the user, for the inspiration which the presence of the local library gives to its own community, for the serendipity which accompanies browsing and search, strong medical libraries must exist wherever there are strong biomedical interests. Often Cummings invoked H.G. Wells, who at the beginning of the 20th century proposed a world brain in which all scientific knowledge would systematically be stored and be easily accessible to all. Society's mechanism for the purpose was the scientific library. Cummings argued that the medical library is interwoven into the basic fabric of research, teaching, and practice, and was therefore an integral part of these pursuits. In a series of speeches, he contended that neglect of libraries over the past 25 years, at a time when the health science enterprise generally was healthy, was a situation that could not be tolerated. Dr. Cummings decided he must pay a visit to see Senator Hill, something he could comfortably arrange given that he had known him quite well while testifying for NIH before his congressional committee. In fact, an important bond had already been previously forged for Hill, had specifically encouraged Cummings to take the NLM directorship. Senator Hill invited Marty and his extramural advisor, Dr. Marjorie Wilson, to come to Alabama and discuss assistance to medical libraries. With the help of the University of Alabama Dean Richardson Hill, a secret meeting on the Alabama campus was arranged. They discussed in great detail the need for an extramural program and what it might look like. The senator committed to it and sent Cummings back to Bethesda to draft up a final bill that was subsequently introduced as S-597 in January of 1965. Shortly thereafter, Representatives Orrin Harris and John Fogarty entered companion bills in the House side. It is important to emphasize that the backbone for much of the 1956 Act rests with the recommendation of the President's Commission on Heart Disease, Cancer, and Stroke, a commission appointed in March of 1964 by President Johnson, once again chaired by DeBakey. One key recommendation called for the establishment of a network of medical libraries, including a limited number of regional libraries, library facility construction, training for medical librarians, and a program of research designed to improve systems and methods for handling medical literature. What was interesting to me in researching this was that there were a number of special subcommittees to the Commission, and one specifically on facilities that produced a report on medical libraries. One of the three members of that group was Mrs. Florence Mahoney. So the library had an influential consumer advocate on its side. In preparing the report, Mahoney sought out Dr. Cummings, someone she had known from the time he had been director of the research at VA, and he provided her with key information that was valuable in preparing the report. Considering the rapid growth of the nation's health programs and activities illustrated on this chart, one can readily see the heavy stresses being put upon the medical library network. As the study group put it, inefficiencies in the medical library network creates an insidious ignorance which neither science nor the practice of medicine can condone. An inadequate library system acts as a brake upon the entirety of the national health programs. Hearings in both the Senate and the House went smoothly. MLA President Al Brannon provided convincing testimony on behalf of the library community. There was no opposition to the bills, and in the House, Fogarty outlined the 7 provisions of the bill as shown here, and in closing forcefully said, libraries must be helped to channel the information that is flowing into them at an accelerating rate in such ways that the knowledge they are receiving may pass on to irrigate the vast regions of men's ignorance. Amazingly enough, some 9 months after Senator Hill proposed the Medical Library Assistance Act, it was signed into law by President Johnson on October 22, 1965. Along with it, groundbreaking provision was an authorization for 5 years at $105 million. With the passage of the Medical Library Assistance Act, the notion of a true biomedical communication network became a bit more than just a vision. Cummings invoked the words of Dr. John Shaw Billings when he spoke to the American Library Association many years before. It is wise to try to know something of the pattern and to guess at some of the problems of tomorrow, but in the meantime we may not fold our hands and wait because we do not see clearly the way to go. Marty was convinced that if he was to convert traditional libraries into active information centers, then research and the application of new technologies was needed. The 3 reports listed here provided impetus for development of national information networks. The NLM Board of Regents quickly developed a 5-year plan for the creation of a biomedical communication network, or as it was to be known in the library world, the BCN. Cummings' effort was greatly assisted by the report of the Special Subcommittee Investigation of the Department of HEW, conducted by Congressman Paul Rogers. Cummings went to the Hill to seek the support of Senator Hill and Congressman Fogarty for his plan. They said they were prepared to appropriate funding as long as some congressional authority could be created. The 1963 Rogers report filled that bill. It covered the needed research, a biomedical information clearinghouse, the transfer of audiovisuals from CDC to NLM, and the NLM role as coordinator of health communication activities in the Public Health Service. With this report in his back pocket, Cummings asked for and received an appropriation of $118,000 and authority for 4 positions to begin an R&D effort to create a Center for Biomedical Communications at the NLM. Like the director before him and the one that would eventually follow him, Cummings wanted a facility that would befit his new program initiatives. With the advent of a grant program, a toxicology information program, the transfer of the NMAC from Atlanta, the ever-expanding MedLars initiative, and the emerging biomedical communication network, the existing building just wasn't adequate. Cummings commissioned 3 feasibility studies, and as you can see here, the 1967 scheme was very similar to that of the actual Lister Hill Center building today. In 1968, Senator Lister Hill retired, and Cummings decided it would be a nice gesture to name the proposed annex after him to recognize his contribution to public health and biomedical communications. Dr. Joseph Volker, a member of the NLM Board of Regents and Vice President of Health Affairs at the University of Alabama, passed along this suggestion to Senator John Sparkman of Alabama. The enthusiasm for the suggestion was overwhelming. At a dinner arranged by Cummings with the Board of Regents, HEW Secretary Wilbur Cohen, and numerous members of Congress in attendance, Senator Sparkman made a stirring speech. It outlined the history of medicine from Hippocrates in 460 BC to the time of Senator Hill's leadership and support for medical research. The speech closed with a proposal to honor the nation's statesmen for health by naming the facility after him. The following day, on June 21, 1968, the speech was entered into the congressional record by Senator Wayne Moss of Oregon, and soon thereafter, at the request of Sparkman, Cummings prepared the wording for a joint resolution. On July 19, Sparkman introduced the joint resolution. It was read twice, considered, read the third time, and passed. On the 24th, it flew through the House and was signed by President Johnson on the 3rd of August. In the spring of 1970, $900,000 was appropriated for the design of the facility, but times they had changed. The lush years of biomedical research had ended. Hill had retired, Fogarty had died, and Shannon had left. The Nixon administration had begun, and the ever-helpful Office of Management and Budget decided not to release the design funds until 1972. By that time, the facility had dropped to 8th on the NIH priority list. Later in 1970, however, there was a pleasant surprise. HEW Secretary Robert Finch's office called and told Cummings they wished to place an employee at the library, a lady by the name of Frances Howard, who was currently the liaison for volunteer hunger programs within HEW. The following day, Fran arrived in Cummings' office, where his political antennae quivered as he quickly realized that sitting before him was Hubert Humphrey's sister. He appointed her as a special assistant for outreach in the extramural program, and boy did she have a knack for outreach, not only to the biomedical community, but up on the Hill and around town. As Cummings told me, Fran was the best gift the Republicans ever gave me. She pushed some key buttons in Washington, and soon Marty was being invited to one-on-one lunches on the Hill with congressmen and senators. Key visits were made in the Senate with ranking members of the Appropriation Committee, namely Warren Magnuson of Washington and Norris Cotton of New Hampshire. On the House side, the two key folks were Daniel Flood of Pennsylvania and Bob Michael. Perhaps the most interesting was the flamboyant Mr. Flood, who before becoming a congressman was a Shakespearean actor. While his waxed handlebar mustache and his glass of spiked orange juice, he theatrically presided over the House Appropriations Subcommittee. He was supportive of the bill, but hardly its prime mover. The joke about Flood was that when he invited you to his office for a brown bag lunch, be sure that lettuce you brought wasn't just the eating kind. According to Marty, the man that deserves a great deal of credit for eventual success was Bob Michael, the House Minority Leader who quietly worked behind the scenes to get his fellow Republicans on board. Congress appropriated $26 million in January 1976, and soon thereafter construction began in earnest. The facility was dedicated on May 22, 1980, with the aging Senator Hill in attendance, and that day Cummings' dream came true. Dr. Cummings retired in 1984, having significantly bolstered the quality of American health science libraries and having transformed the NLM into a national biomedical communications center. In August of 1984, Dr. Donald A.B. Lindbergh took over the reins of NLM, and I was pleased to remain as his deputy. As I said in this 1984 interview with JAMA, the choice of Don Lindbergh brought a whole new perspective on information science, really one unparalleled in the history of the institution. From the beginning, Don set the tone when he cautioned, we have to be interested in advanced information management systems, but we also have a great interest in making sure that what results is affordable, that it contributes to solving medical problems and reducing costs and increasing access to the best care. It was that perspective that would lead to significant advances over the succeeding next 20 years, as major initiatives in imaging, telemedicine, medical language development, high-performance computing, outreach, and consumer health took center stage at the NLM. But perhaps the most mission-altering activity was the emergence of a whole new category of information, biotechnology information. Indeed, it was a sea-changing event when on March 6, 1987, Chairman Claude Pepper called to order his Select Committee on Aging to deal, as he put it, with nothing less than the mystery of human life and the unfolding scroll of knowledge seeking to penetrate that mystery, which is life itself. With these words, Senator Pepper introduced H.R. 393, a bill to establish the National Center for Biotechnology Information at the NLM. 2 months earlier, at the NLM Board of Regents had just published its ambitious long-range plan to guide the institution into the 21st century. From the moment Dawn assumed the directorship, planning became a consuming way of life at the library. Over 100 leaders in medicine, librarianship, academia, government, and industry participated in the rigorous planning process, forming 5 panels covering the principal domains of NLM. Panel 3, obtaining factual information from databases, was the scene of an impassioned and instructive discussion led by Alan Maxson from Harvard. That discussion centered on the importance of the field of biotechnology and the need to somehow harness the volume of the data that the genetic revolution in science was sure to produce. The panel and the regents quickly recognized that a singular and immediate window of opportunity existed for the NLM to play a major role in the arena of molecular biology information. Their resulting recommendation was to create the NCBI as an intramural component of the NLM to serve both as a repository and distribution center for the growing body of knowledge and as a unique resource for developing analysis and communication tools for molecular biology. There were many worthwhile suggestions in the 1986 long-range plan, but the challenge facing the director was to select the right one that would most move the institution forward. He chose wisely among competing priorities, and so doing set the course to extend NLM's sphere beyond its traditional bibliographic databases to encompass biotechnology data. Meanwhile, up on the Hill, Brady Matheny, on behalf of the Delegation for Basic Biomedical Research, was sponsoring briefings for congressional members and staff on the importance to the country of supporting genomic research. Nobelists James Watson and David Baltimore in particular were tireless in their efforts and most persuasive. The newly formed Friends of the NLM saw this as an opportune time to approach the Hill on the need for a biotechnology information center and sought out Claude Pepper, a champion for medical research and also, not coincidentally, a close friend of Francis Howard. At a meeting arranged by the Friends, the senator listened attentively, expressed his interest in fostering the creation of the center, and sent us all back home to write a piece on the benefits of biotechnology research that would be pegged, as he said, at the 5th grade level, so folks up here in the Congress can understand it. With assistance from Lister Hill director Dan Macy's, a freelance writer by the name of Natalie Spingard, and NLM's information, Bob Maynard, a piece titled Talking One Genetic Language was prepared and sent downtown to the senator. After several weeks, Mr. Pepper called and asked to speak with Dr. Lindbergh. Since he was out of town, I was put on the phone. The senator explained that he had read the piece and then said, "Dr. Smith, please come down to my office so we can talk about biotechnology." On the way downtown, all I could think of was, please don't ask Dr. Smith a medical question. Fortunately, the inquiries were non-medical. He expressed his delight with the write-up, the contents of which he had already used at a Florida State University commencement speech. At that meeting, he indicated a bill would be prepared, and shortly thereafter, H.R. 5271 was introduced. The bill was entered late in the congressional session, but to our delight it was reintroduced the following session as H.R. 393. Pepper this time was determined to give it some visibility, and he surely did. On the day of the hearing, room 2359, Rabin Office Building, was packed with government officials, representing virtually the entire bureaucratic alphabet, including OMB, OTA, GAO, HHS, and of course NLM and NIH. Mr. Pepper entered the hearing room, followed by his staff director, Kathleen Cravetti, and her assistant, Melanie Maudlin. As he passed the NLM delegation, he offered his hand to Fran Howard and escorted her up front to sit next to him, much to the amazement of the crowd. NIH Director Weingarten, seated behind me, tapped me on the shoulder and whispered, "Doesn't she work for you at NLM?" The hearing began with Mr. Pepper saying that H.R. 393 brought to mind the memory of one of the noblest and most enlightened men, Hubert Humphrey, who first championed the improvement of federal science information programs. Pepper then turned to Fran and asked if she would like to make an opening statement, which she proceeded to do. Our political superiors, having no advance notice of Fran's role in this, Don Lindbergh and I figured if we were to ever be given our pink slips, that would be the day. It was a massively put-together hearing with some 15 witnesses, including 5 patients. One of the patients was Randy Rodriguez, a 17-year-old victim of growth hormone deficiency, who captured the attention of the audience and the senator. Randy told how, as a 6th grader, he had been ridiculed, called a shrimp, shorty, and the like, and that he had twice attempted suicide. Without the miracle of biotechnology, he reported, he wouldn't have grown 1.5 feet from 4'2" to 5'7". And as he told Mr. Pepper, for the first time he had a social life that included the opposite sex. There were nevertheless major impediments to passage of the bill. For Pepper's Select Committee on Aging had no legislative authority. That rested with Congressman Waxman's Energy and Commerce Committee. NIH wasn't up for reauthorization in 1987, so essentially the bill was forced to proceed in its freestanding state, making passage much, much more difficult. Mr. Pepper nevertheless testified before the HHS Appropriations Subcommittee, resulting in $3.85 million to get the program rolling. The following year, the NIH authorization did come up for renewal, and the languishing Pepper bill was referred to the Energy and Commerce Committee, where it remained dormant. Mr. Pepper, who chaired the Rules Committee, through which all bills must pass, had one more card to play. A deal was struck in a most polite conversation. Mr. Pepper agreed to move a bill of Mr. Waxman's out of the Rules Committee, and Mr. Waxman promised he would fold the provisions of H.R. 393 into the NIH reauthorization bill. This was formally accomplished through a hearing on February 22, 1988. As agreed, he invited Pepper to testify, along with Victor McCusick, Weingarten, and Lindbergh, and together they built the necessary congressional record to support passage. With the helpful assistance in the Senate of Lawton Charles and Edward Kennedy, the companion bill was passed, and President Reagan made it all official in November of 1988 when he signed the Public Law 100-607. Lindbergh's great aspiration for the center was that it could somehow pull together the fragmented and uncoordinated efforts going on in biotechnology information and create an information resource that could make optimum progress in the field. Lindbergh had chosen the right planning option from his advisors in seeking a biotech center, and he made the right choice to deal with the challenge ahead, namely the appointment of its director, Dr. David Littman. Under his direction, the center has rapidly become the information hub of the molecular biology revolution. This chart gives you a sense of both the growth in data that is being managed and curated, as well as the growing number of users being served and the variety of services that are being provided to serve those users. It is a true success story and one vital to today's scientific discovery process. With NCBI's recent initiative to create a database to connect clinical and genotype data From large long-term studies, such an information resource may someday lead to the development of therapeutic agents that are targeted to patients' genetic makeup, ushering in an era of personalized medicine. To foster these promises on the horizon, to meet the needs of the ever-growing physical collection, and to support NLM's expanded role, a new physical facility has been high on NLM's agenda. The current building, which predates the 1988 Biotech Center, were made to hold fewer than 650 staff. NLM now houses more than 1,300 and is essentially bursting at the seams. Despite significant odds, Lindbergh secured the funds to design an expanded facility. This was accomplished in spite of tight budgets, a reluctant NIH management, and a silent House Appropriations Subcommittee. Fortunately, along with a strong backing of the Senate Appropriations Subcommittee, a sleight of hand took place in the House when Congressman Young's full Appropriations Committee inserted the necessary design language into what essentially was the military pay supplemental appropriation. The details of the rest of that story will remain embargoed to protect the innocent. Well, the history lesson is virtually over, but medicine's library of the 21st century is just beginning. The latest long-range plan released by the library asks the question, what might the next 20 years hold? Having seen the way information technology has advanced in the past 20 years and dramatically changed the way we access information, we must, of course, approach any predictions with a good deal of trepidation. We must keep in mind the old Chinese proverb, to prophesy is extremely difficult, especially with regard to the future. Likewise, one must be careful not to be too ambitious, for as Fiedler reminds us, he who lives by the crystal ball soon learns to eat ground glass. But as Billings has told us, we must certainly know something of the emerging patterns of tomorrow, have some good guesses of the problems ahead, and not be hesitant to begin that journey. It is that spirit and the sense of the public good that has motivated those who in the past have created legislation, launched new programs, provided leadership, and become legends themselves. Now, in the recent planning sessions, it was stated that the role of the NLM in the 21st century is to gather, connect, store, analyze, and repackage into understandable units the emerging health knowledge so it can be used at the level needed from senior researchers to individuals and families. In this world, the NLM will be running a real-time interactive encyclopedia of today's health knowledge at levels of usability, at all levels of usability. And clearly, each and every one of you here at NLM and all those hard-working medical librarians and information specialists throughout the national network have a major role to play in this new environment. As NLM's two leaders, Don Lindbergh and Betsy Humphreys, have said, today's medical libraries have unprecedented opportunities to contribute to better quality and efficiency in healthcare education and research. Those who support and lead medical libraries should seize these opportunities. The future is in their hands. I couldn't agree more. It has been an honor to present the Leiter Lecture, so now, goodbye. I'm heading back to retirement. Thank you. I'd like to take just a second, if I might, to tell you that I want to thank the many folks at NCBI, Janet and Tim and other clerical staff who have helped me, to Fran in the information office, and especially to Suzanne Aubuchon for the logistics and support, to Joe Fitzgerald for his graphics, for Bob Maynard for editing, and for Sarah Eilers in HMD for providing excellent background information for me. Simply put, without the help of all these folks, this task would have been impossible for me. Thank you to all of them. Thank you for coming.